Catelyn Stark is one of the most emotionally complex characters in Game of Thrones, and her psychology is deeply rooted in a powerful maternal instinct that defines nearly all of her actions. As the Lady of Winterfell and mother to 5 children, Catelyn's sense of identity is inseparable from her role as a protector. Her decisions, whether strategic or impulsive, consistently stem from an overwhelming desire to safeguard her family in a brutal and unpredictable world. This protective instinct is not merely emotional. It functions as a psychological framework through which she interprets threats, alliances, and moral choices. In a political environment where survival often demands cold calculation, Catelyn's motivations remain intensely personal, revealing how maternal attachment can shape perception, judgment, and behavior under extreme pressure. Her protective psychology is evident from the earliest moments of the story, particularly when her son Bran is attacked after discovering a secret that could destabilize the realm. Catelyn's reaction is immediate and visceral, reflecting a profound psychological state in which maternal fear overrides all other concerns. She becomes hyper-aware of danger and begins interpreting the world through the lens of potential threats to her children. This transformation illustrates a key psychological concept. When a parent perceives danger to their offspring, the brain shifts into a heightened state of vigilance, amplifying emotional responses and prioritizing defensive actions over rational deliberation. For Catelyn, this shift becomes permanent, shaping her interactions with nearly every character she encounters afterward. The arrest of Tyrion Lannister exemplifies how her protective instincts can drive decisions that have enormous political consequences. Convinced that Tyrion was responsible for the attempt on Bran's life, Catelyn chooses to capture him despite the fragile balance of power between the great houses of Westeros. From a purely strategic perspective, this act is reckless, yet psychologically it reflects the intense need for justice that often accompanies parental protection. When a child is threatened, many parents feel compelled to act decisively, even if the broader implications are uncertain or dangerous. Catelyn's choice illustrates how emotional reasoning, particularly when fueled by fear and anger, can override political prudence. Her relationship with Robb Stark further highlights the complexity of protective psychology when children begin to assume adult roles. As Robb becomes king in the north and leads armies into battle, Catelyn struggles with the tension between respecting his authority and continuing to see him as the son she must protect. Psychologically, this conflict represents a transitional phase that many parents experience when their children move from dependency to independence. For Catelyn, however, the stakes are life and death, intensifying the emotional weight of this transition. Her attempts to advise Robb often come from genuine wisdom, yet they are also colored by anxiety and a lingering desire to shield him from the harsh realities of leadership. Catelyn's distrust of Jon Snow reveals another dimension of her protective mindset, the tendency to perceive outsiders as potential threats to family stability. Jon's status as Ned Stark's illegitimate son creates a psychological tension for Catelyn, who interprets his presence as a symbolic challenge to her children's legitimacy and inheritance. While Jon himself poses no real danger, Catelyn's emotional response demonstrates how protective instincts can sometimes manifest as exclusion or hostility toward individuals perceived as rivals. In psychological terms, this behavior reflects a defensive mechanism aimed at preserving the integrity and security of one's immediate social unit. The war that follows Ned Stark's execution intensifies Catelyn's protective instincts to an almost unbearable degree. With her husband dead and her children scattered across a continent consumed by conflict, her sense of control collapses. Psychologically, this situation produces chronic stress and grief, forcing Catelyn into a constant state of emotional vigilance. Every decision becomes a desperate attempt to minimize loss, even as the circumstances around her spiral beyond her control. This ongoing tension reveals how prolonged exposure to danger can reshape a person's emotional landscape, reinforcing protective behaviors while simultaneously eroding hope. Her decision to release Jaime Lannister in exchange for her daughters represents one of the most controversial actions she takes during the war. Politically, it undermines Robb's authority and jeopardizes his strategic position. Psychologically, however, the decision is entirely consistent with her identity as a mother. Faced with the possibility that her daughters may be tortured or killed, Catelyn prioritizes their safety above all other considerations. This moment illustrates how protective instincts can lead individuals to sacrifice broader responsibilities when the immediate survival of loved ones is at stake. Catelyn's emotional resilience throughout the war demonstrates the paradox of protective psychology. The same instinct that motivates strength can also deepen vulnerability. Each loss she experiences, Ned's death, Bran and Rickon believed dead, Sansa and Arya captured, amplifies her sense of failure as a protector. Parents who define themselves through the safety of their children often experience profound guilt when circumstances prevent them from fulfilling that role. In Catelyn's case, this guilt becomes a heavy emotional burden that she carries through every subsequent decision. Her protective instincts also influence her diplomatic behavior, shaping the alliances she seeks and the advice she gives to Robb and his allies. Catelyn consistently advocates caution and negotiation, not because she lacks courage, but because she understands the cost of war in deeply personal terms. Unlike many of the political figures around her, she does not view conflict as a game of power, but as a force that destroys families and communities. This perspective highlights how psychological priorities can shape political strategies in subtle but significant ways. Ultimately, Catelyn Stark embodies the tragic dimension of protective love in a world defined by violence and betrayal. Her instincts are fundamentally human and deeply relatable, yet the environment of Westeros punishes emotional vulnerability. The tragedy of her character lies not in misguided intentions, but in the impossibility of protecting everyone she loves. Through Catelyn, the narrative explores how the instinct to protect, one of the most powerful forces in human psychology, can become both a source of strength and a path to heartbreak. As the war intensifies, Catelyn Stark's psychological state begins to shift from protective determination to profound emotional exhaustion. The cumulative weight of trauma gradually erodes the stability that once defined her character. In psychological terms, Catelyn experiences a progressive collapse of the identity she built around safeguarding her family. Each loss she suffers weakens the belief that her actions can meaningfully alter the outcome of events. This erosion of agency is a central feature of trauma, particularly when individuals are repeatedly confronted with situations where their efforts to protect others fail. The news that Bran and Rickon have been killed devastates Catelyn in ways that go beyond ordinary grief. For a mother whose primary purpose has been to keep her children safe, the apparent loss of two sons represents a catastrophic psychological blow. Grief in this context is intertwined with self-blame, creating a cycle of emotional pain that becomes increasingly difficult to escape. Catelyn's sorrow is not simply about the deaths themselves. It is about the perceived failure of her protective role, which had previously given structure and meaning to her life. This emotional collapse becomes more visible in her interactions with Robb and his bannermen. While she continues to offer advice and support, there's a growing sense that the war has taken something essential from her. Trauma often produces a state of emotional numbness in which individuals continue functioning outwardly while feeling internally disconnected from hope or optimism. Catelyn's demeanor increasingly reflects this state, as though she is moving through events with the awareness that the world she once knew has already been destroyed. Her desperation to secure the return of her daughters intensifies after losing Bran and Rickon. Psychologically, this reaction can be understood as an attempt to restore a sense of balance after overwhelming loss. When individuals experience trauma, they often focus intensely on the remaining aspects of their lives that still offer meaning or connection. For Catelyn, Sansa and Arya become the last fragments of the family she is fighting to preserve. This focus drives her to take risks that others interpret as irrational, but that make emotional sense within her psychological framework. The growing tension between Catelyn and Robb also reflects the emotional strain created by war and loss. As king, Robb must prioritize military strategy and the expectations of his allies, while Catelyn continues to evaluate every decision through the lens of family survival. This divergence highlights the psychological divide between leadership and parenthood in a time of crisis. Where Robb sees armies and alliances, Catelyn sees sons and daughters, whose lives hang in the balance. The betrayal of the Freys and Boltons during the Red Wedding represents the ultimate collapse of Catelyn's protective world. In that moment, The illusion that she could shield her family from the brutality of Westerosi politics is shattered completely. The psychological impact of such betrayal is immense, particularly when trust has been extended in good faith. For Catelyn, the event is not merely a political disaster, but a profound violation of the social bonds that once offered a semblance of order in a chaotic world. As the massacre unfolds, Catelyn's behavior becomes increasingly frantic and desperate, reflecting the final stage of psychological collapse under extreme trauma. Her attempt to bargain for Robb's life by threatening Walder Frey's wife is not a calculated strategy, but a raw expression of maternal desperation. In moments of overwhelming fear, the human mind often abandons structured reasoning in favor of instinctive emotional responses. Catelyn's actions in these final moments capture the purest and most tragic form of protective love. The death of Robb Stark marks the complete destruction of the identity that once sustained her. In psychological terms, the loss of a child is often described as one of the most devastating experiences a parent can endure. For Catelyn, the moment represents not only the loss of her son, but also the collapse of the narrative that had guided her life. The belief that she could protect her family is replaced by the realization that the world is governed by forces far beyond her control. Her final moments reveal the profound emptiness that trauma can create when all sources of meaning have been stripped away. After witnessing Robb's death, Catelyn's grief becomes almost surreal, as though the emotional intensity has pushed her beyond the limits of ordinary experience. Psychologists often describe this state as dissociation, a mental defense mechanism that allows the mind to distance itself from unbearable pain. In Catelyn's case, it reflects the complete breakdown of the psychological structures that once defined her identity. Catelyn Stark's story ultimately serves as a powerful exploration of how love, trauma, and identity intersect in times of extreme crisis. Her journey illustrates the psychological cost of living in a world where the instinct to protect collides with forces of violence and betrayal. Through her character, the narrative reveals that the desire to safeguard those we love can be both the greatest strength a person possesses and the deepest vulnerability they carry.